I've got an affinity for the strange, not particularly in like people or whatever you are, in things like videos, music, and extremely surprisingly, video games. What constitutes strange varies quite a lot. You've got Hylics, Dujana, Crypt Worlds, and whilst they're all peculiar in their own right, they never really hit my emotional grey zone, quite like when I laid eyes upon one of my favourite games of 2021. Ultra Kill doesn't count. Cruelty Squad might be one of the most bizarre looking titles that I've ever seen, and I know that we're all very keen on getting our novel and original observations out of the way, so to anyone on the brink of commenting a variation of developers' grammar drugs, I want you to lay on a train track and consider if the average intelligence of the world would go up if you didn't get off. And while you're doing that, acknowledge that there's a genuine artistry to making something this garish in its presentation. Even though this video is going to boil down to, oh, this game's so quirky to look at, I think I'd be doing it a disservice by not mentioning that there's still an interesting game beyond the unconventional appearance. Despite initially being a simple game about shooting the man, the speed at which you can be returned to mush and the sprawling, open-ended nature of the levels leads to a game that can initially play like a stealth shooter with a lot of exploration elements, exacerbated by hidden levels and weapons for those with an itch to get to new places. But as levels go on, you'll go from Stealthy Snake from Splinter Cell to I've played Quake for 30 years and bee-hopped my way to Carpal Tunnel. The Quake-style strafe hopping, combined with the upgrades that you can get, really expand how you traverse the environment, and as you learn how to dome people before they start to wriggle around, it becomes the Nürburgring with guns that makes for an odd little movement shooter that shouldn't work, but it does. Over time, as I started to get used to the gameplay, I expected the visuals to start to fade into the background and become a white noise to my human racetrack, but it never really did. Even now, after 100%ing the game and going back to reset my save for this video, I still find my gaze fixated on the visuals that can only be described as looking at the feeling of stepping on Lego. Despite the visuals' conceptual level being quite grounded in some cases, a cul-de-sac, a mall, a block of flats, they still all air some level of wrong, but not amateur. Like, look, let's make a shitty house in Unity. Bing bang bosh, it doesn't look anything fucking like Cruelty Squad. This looks like a piece of work that's deliberately trying to strike the same part of you that finds human robots uncanny, but with mundane objects to create a new kind of discomfort? This looks like a project that you make to figure out how to load objects into an engine. Because it is. So, what's going on here? What is Cruelty Squad doing that makes its visuals so striking, crusty, just... It hits me right in the part of my brain that watches Pilot Red Sun videos on repeat. I love it! Oh yeah, spoilers ahead, I would recommend that you play it. I'm going to be spoiling the whole game. Firstly, we should probably address this absolute mess that's plastered to the screen, because it plays a very important role in making everything a little bit more odd to pass visually throughout the whole game. Shigeru Miyamoto once said, a delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad. But not a lot of people know what he said immediately after it. If the heads-up display starts to get in the way, I'd have a better time fitting heads up my arse. Traditionally, a HUD's composition should try and keep the information as concise as possible, and do so in a way that is unintrusive. We are not in traditional composition territory. Big old border across every single axis, giant blob that's just enough out of the top left corner to obscure everything that's in that area, and your gun covers everything in your bottom right. Unless you're using anything powerful, at which point it's Halo fucking 2! You could take a mundane scene and slap this on top, and immediately you're getting thrown for a loop, because it messes with your sense of perspective by not allowing you to take in all the information in your peripheral. The border especially makes it so that even if your FOV is set to deer levels, it still supplies a tunnel vision. This especially plays a part in your first playthrough. The wide and sprawling levels without a real guide on how you're supposed to get to your objective gets even more confusing when you're not able to get a proper grip on what's around you. Once you're familiar with the environment, it's fine, because you've built up the mental map of the space, but this HUD really messes with your ability to build that map. On top of that, the health GIF, or whatever's going on here, is always large and jiggling, but the information that tells you exactly how close you are to death is small and bleeds into the color of the moving tumor. When it's all calm, this is here to add uncertainty to your vision, but when you're in the heat of the moment, it adds to a sense of panic of just not knowing how close you are to death. But that's probably not the first thing that you're worried about. You're probably more concerned with, what is that? Is it flesh? Is it goo? What am I looking at? Why do the arms jiggle but the gun doesn't? Where's the light source? What am I looking at? While the composition of this is key in throwing off your sense of understanding, the stylization and how it complements the world that you're in is what completes its look. You ever think about walls? more specifically what's on the wall. Common sense says that most games should have a consistent colour scheme and make use of complementary colours to create your environment. TF2, a lot of browns and muddied tones for the main environment, soft blue or grey skybox, and then the team colours pop out of the scenery with reds and blues. Not exactly a hard concept to follow unless you're the type of person to get stumped by a McDonald's kiosk, but simple solutions to visual problems normally work best. However, it isn't enough that you keep your colour sample small. If you're colourblind, I'm sorry for what I'm about to do to you, but even though I'm only using 2 colours here, it doesn't mean that it's pleasant to read, even more so if I make the text incredibly small. These colours aren't just contrasting, they're clashing incredibly hard. Early on in the game, in internal spaces especially, you'll find a lot of this blinding pain. Bright neon colours generally don't tend to go well together, and looking at more conventional composition, you'd only really use these colours as highlights to draw attention to the player since they're standing out. So naturally, Cruelty Squad pulls into this from time to time, but while it might be very comfortable with clawing at the back of your retina, it's only a component of what occasionally gives this game its identity. There's frequent use of switching up colour, going from glaring neons and then sitting on greys and reds, often imbuing both into the same shot to represent objects of equal importance to give you mixed visual messaging. Not to mention how this starts to collide with smaller elements of the HUD as they start to get harder to read since the colour that they're laying on is constantly switching from complementary to contrasting, and anywhere in between. I especially like this portion of Idiot Party where the floors are literally pitch black and make the walls the most standout element of your vision, and then you go down a floor and now it's a glaring mess. So even though the geometry of the space hasn't changed dramatically, the way that you view the scene has changed massively. Even in mundane environments, the game feels weird. You'll be bee-hopping along and nothing's immediately amiss, and then you stop and go, like, I know what I'm looking at, but I don't know what I'm looking at. This quaint little bookcase has been battered and bruised until only a shell of its former self exists after compression. While it's impossible to say exactly what process the devs took to get this uncomfortable, I've got a decent assumption that they're reducing the image resolution, emulating or just actually using an exaggerated lossy compression type, and then using a reduced color map to give it that extra little bit of crust. That's not to say that something like this looks unpleasant because it's small. File size doesn't dictate discomfort. Games like Katamari do a great job at making something traditionally aesthetically pleasing with file constraints by being smart about their choice in colors and, more importantly, only trying to communicate the details that you need to understand to get what the object is. Cruelty Squad is taking a massive amount of detail and giving it a couple hundred pixels to communicate, and while it can still clearly tell you that it's a car, it's also whispering, maybe I'm also made out of Funko Pops, and like, comment, subscribe. I have a clue what's going on with these textures. Combine Color Catastrophe and the Compression Crusade together and you get environments that pull your eye from every direction that manage to always give you the full picture, but also nothing at all at the same time. None of this is to say that rubbing colourful sandpaper on the eyeballs is all that's done well. Early levels in particular are very bold in their use of colour and texturing walls with things like faces to create massive mismatches in what we would expect from areas. But after level 3, Cruelty Squad starts to use it more sparingly, to punctuate certain areas before you can get used to it. Androgen Assault isn't a clown blender the way that Pharmacokinetics is. The primary portion of Androgen is greys and reds, with a little bit of dark blues here and there. It's cold, corporate, and certainly not normal, but it's unassuming. Now go take out this guy and... okay, well, this is not what walls are supposed to be made out of. Please stop spitting, sir. It's certainly bizarre, but it's no longer assaulting the way that it would have needed to be if the game was doing nothing more than trying to be an eyesore. If there was a steady incline in how disconnected the color palettes and spaces got from reality, you'd start to grow accustomed to the environments and it'd become predictable. The qualities of the artwork would become the novelty of what you're looking at, not how it used them visuals in interesting ways. Inside this alternate universe, the final level would probably still be interesting from an aesthetic perspective, but would suffer from being packed in between levels that were absurd in similar ways. By using the same art style to explore a range, from grounded to absurdist landscapes, Cruelty Squad never allows its imagery to get stale, and while at no point is it normal, it doesn't allow anything to become predictably unusual. Alright, that's all well and good. But why is my arm jiggling? And also, why is everyone else? Initially, I thought this might be the game emulating a PlayStation 1 hardware limitation, where vertices can only move in whole integers, creating this kind of wibble-wobble effect that you see. I'm certain that this is what inspired the visual effect, but it's not exactly the same. I'm gonna hazard a guess here, and it is a guess because, well, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm decently certain that the vertex warping is occurring based on an integer larger than per pixel, so it's snapping vertices based on every 5 or 10 pixels. Don't quote me on that, I have a C in middle school level maths as my highest grade. I stopped understanding what I was saying after the word vertice. All you need to know is jiggle good. Environments and objects also aren't subject to the same visual effect, which also goes for the one right in front of you, which helps to emphasize the feeling of a lack of consistency, even though there are technically rules to how this works. When you place it alongside the rest of the presentation, you start to get a concoction that just shouldn't work. By every conventional understanding of nice looking, this is putrid, but the frequency and consistency of Cruelty Squad's ability to go against your expectations of how a scene should be presented is what really gives it that edge and makes it so satisfying to look at. And there's more going on here that I'm probably not able to capture. You ever notice how the buildings never cast a shadow but are affected by lighting? Or how the fog cuts off an image in hard sets rather than being a gradient applied over distance? None of these are normally what you'd consider good, but by merging them all together and applying some thought as to what they do to the visuals, you can create an incredibly distinct image to go alongside your cleverly disguised speedrunning game. Here's my PB, go ahead and beat it, dickhead. Beyond just how distinct this game is in its appeal, I think it also serves as a great little study piece on how there are expectations about what makes for quality imagery, but no set rules on what makes something look good or bad. For 99% of projects, yeah, none of these are good qualities for a game to incorporate, but by removing yourself from the general idea of positives and negatives, you can start to see all of these things for what they really are, properties that apply to an image, and lean into and away from the ideas that create the vision that you want. Don't confuse this with me going, I want games to look like shit actually, but what I am saying is that Cruelty Squad exemplifies the power of removing yourself from traditional artistic convention to develop a unique creation, with equally as much vigor as it does vomit. And in order to follow in Cruelty Squad's footsteps, every video will now be recorded with my mic set to 8000 Hz. I hope you look forward to it. TLDW... Wow, the devs really were on drugs for this one.